All right, I'm always pleased when I remember to start the recording before we actually start, as opposed to 5 minutes in. Thank you for joining us today. I am excited to welcome Dr. DeLean Tolbert Smith. She is an assistant professor of industrial manufacturing and systems engineering at UM-Dearborn. She earned her PhD in engineering education from Purdue University, her MSc in industrial and operations engineering from U of M, and her BSc in electrical engineering from UM-Dearborn. Through her dissertation research, she identified ways that Black youth learn engineering skills through everyday experiences, and she hopes to leverage her faculty position to serve as a bridge builder, connecting more Detroit families and community resources, other nations, and the collegiate engineering classroom. And this time I will remember to pin her, which I think means that when she is sharing video, you will see her still, but everyone correct me very quickly if that's not the case. I know that you couldn't see Aaron for his first couple minutes of talking. All right, and then I'm going to shut up, DeLean, and let you take over.
Okay, can you see me in my lovely sky? All right, great. Let me just get delete that. All right, good morning, everyone. I do ask for a little grace. I am, as you can imagine, kind of jumping between meetings, and I wanted to just preface that with, if you see me, taking a deep breath, it is not because I am so worried that you all don't care or aren't listening, but I am just catching my breath. So good morning. I am so excited to share a bit of my work with you all this today, and I thank you all for commenting there. I am looking forward to sharing, and what I'm going to do is it's a bit of a talk, and it's also, we'll share some of my research, but it's also a bit of a reflection as a researcher who is kind of growing and developing in this space and learning along the way, which we all should be doing. And I kind of got this style of talking when I went to I was in an English dissertation, and I noticed at this dissertation, my friend read her document, or large sections of her document. And at first I was thinking, this is so different, how am I supposed to, what do I take from this? And then I saw it again at an EER conference, and I thought to myself, this actually really invites some different ways of thinking through our work. It kind of hopes to kind of stir up critical thinking. And it's an ability to walk with the scholar as they're thinking through the implications of their work, what they are learning, what they hope to share, what they can contribute. And so as I share today, I actually am going to center my talk around 4 questions. And what I ask is, as I discuss these 4 questions, I would hope that I have numbered them. So in the comments, feel free to kind of put a not quotation marks, parentheses, question 1, and your comments about that question, and it could be, as I'm reflecting, it could be your critiques. I'm open to critique. There could be references that you want to share. And so I just invite you to share those with me along the way. So let's get started there. I'm going to share my screen. All right, can I just get a thumbs up in the chat or verbal if you all are seeing my slide centering that my first slide, which should be a picture of UM-Dearborn and my title? Okay, wonderful, thank you. So first, I really just, I'm excited to be here. I want to thank the department and Robin for working with me to get on the schedule. It's an honor. I am a fellow, I'm an alum of U of M Ann Arbor, and I am at U of M Dearborn, and I so appreciate the camaraderie we have as we're working together, sharing our research, and I'm glad to be giving one of these talks this year. And so my topic for today is STEM incubators, centering Black families' rightful presence in STEM. This is important to me, and you'll also hear tidbits of my story, but it's important to me because I am someone who came from a Black STEM family. whether the engineers were professional engineers, whether they were those who worked in plants, whether they are those who are kind of hobbyists and they just like to fix things and do things, or maybe those people who had no idea what engineering was, no interest, but they knew that they had to find ways to support me in my endeavors, or perhaps these people were community leaders who ran STEM organizations and gave me the opportunity to practice as a young person. These were all critical people who, in some instances and in some ways, are part of my family. They're part of the community that helped to push and motivate me to be who I am today. So with that background, you will notice that perhaps there is some level of bias towards thinking that Black families do belong and have rightful presence in STEM, and in fact, serve as incubators for those of us who go down STEM pathways, even for those who are in these programs and experiences and don't do STEM. And one of the ways I'm trying to make sure it's just not my bias and my preference for how awesome my community was is I'm doing this research to provide evidence, scholarly evidence that what I experienced and what those like me have experienced is not just a one-off, but there is something going on in our community that's great. So my talk today is going to center around 4 questions. The first question is, what is the Black family? The second question is, what are some of the theoretical underpinnings of my work? So while there are lots of scholars who are doing awesome work, and there are more scholars starting to look at families from Black families from an asset-based perspective, I am going to primarily focus on the things that I'm applying to my work. And how maybe even I've used or reference to other scholars who are who are also contributing in this space. My third question that I'm going to center my talk on are, what are some appropriate methodologies for centering Black families? Again, those that I've used and what I've learned from them. And the fourth is, what do we know about the impact of their rightful presence? So I will share, I have a recent paper that's under review. I have a couple of things that I've learned from that paper. And so I hope to share that with you all, along with what some other scholars are starting to find. So let's dive in. Again, in the comments, you can write question 1, 2, 3, or 4, and then with your comment or your reference or your critique. And I'll be welcome, and we can invite that into the discussion towards the end. So what is the Black family? So the first thing, and it may be surprised, but I think many of us would understand that there is no one unified definition of the Black family. And I want to make sure that that's clear, because if you associate this idea of one definition of the Black family and you go back to deficit-oriented research, which a lot of the research that has looked at the impact of Black families in education and on STEM pathways has deferred to an urban Black family, a poor Black family, a single mother, single parent Black family, and then because it's a deficit-oriented work then places the blame on the lack of representation or the lack of anything, or what's missing and where the gap is on the Black community. And so what I want to highlight here is that we need to, as researchers, broaden our understanding of what it means to explore and understand the impact, influence, and even the characteristics of Black families. They are richly diverse in structure, in the roles that the members serve, in socioeconomic status, and even where they live. And this is a direct challenge to focusing our research on urban. And I think that if I were to think about why folks look at urban, we do have urban communities are more highly populated with communities of color. But we have to be very careful that we also explore the experiences of perhaps a middle-class suburban Black families. What are some of those? And we're actually seeing that some of our students have similar, when it comes to the challenges they face in the classroom, negative stereotypes, typical perceptions of them, even the ways teachers react to Black students, particularly Black males. We see that has urban, suburban, rural, we're seeing some similar challenges that our students face. So my admonition to researchers is that we carefully avoid monolithic and even stereotypical representations of Black families. And so when we look at now the design and the characteristics of different Black families, What you would notice when you do this work, and even if you were making observations on several families that you may know, you might notice that there are some extensive kinship ties in Black communities, and there are very large family networks. If you were to take a moment and reflect on what I shared at the very beginning of our time together, I talked about many different types of people who were supportive. So I had my family, my immediate family, who exposed me to STEM and engineering, tinkering and building. But I also mentioned there are people who had no engineering background who were supportive, and they had high expectations for my academic success. But then there were also community members who ran organizations who made sure that I was a part of those. And while to some communities that may seem like very disjointed aspects of a network or even of family, or not even be considered as family, these are people who have become family for me and have the role, they have an authoritative voice in my life. They can provide feedback, they can also provide correction. And so what I want to define here is that Black families can include immediate family members in the home, extended family members who reside outside of the home, and fictive kin. These are those people that have no blood relation, but who take on and perceived and are honored as family, meaning they have some say and some authority, as I've mentioned. So we may be very familiar with mothers and fathers, siblings and grandparents as more traditional examples of family. However, I also like to reference my friend Dr. Kelly Hughes and her work on other mothers, and how there are Black female teachers in education often take on this role as mothers, even in the classroom. So while even that's in a very in a formal environment, you have access to family members even in the school classroom for that student. Now, even while the other mothers serve in the classroom and have impact beyond the classroom, a lot of what we see, the impact of these large Black familial networks actually exists within informal community-based learning spaces. That's one. They positively impact learning and professional achievement by modeling resilience and by embracing Black educational values. This is where I want to talk about one of the challenges to deficit-oriented scholarship on Black families, particularly parental engagement, is that they define parental engagement by practices that were often seen in white middle-class communities. Let me take an example. Consider that parental engagement was looked at as attending field trips, PTO meetings, providing help with schoolwork, volunteering in the building. So my question for you is, do you see a trend in these? I'll mention them again. Do you see a trend in parents who can attend field trips, PTO meetings, providing help with schoolwork, and volunteering in the building? The trend with these, let me see, someone made a comment here. Flexible jobs. Thank you, yes. People who have flexible work schedules. So this is not to say that Black parents don't have flexible work schedules, but what we want to highlight is that parental engagement literature highlights those parents that do have flexible work schedules. And this is a problem, especially when they have flexible work schedules and they're also able to come to the buildings, they can be there all day. And I think you all hit the nail on the head, and I want to highlight, consider that Black and African-American communities consistently and continue to face systemic obstacles related to obtaining what we call good jobs over generations. And if we look at this over generations, we have to understand that this will, if you're looking at a parent who has to work several jobs, or whether they be a single parent or whether they be two-parent household or a multi-generational home together, their work schedules may not allow them to do what is traditionally accepted as positive parental impact. And so this will affect their availability to support their children in schools for extended period of time. They may be able to come to a meeting, they may be able to attend a presentation here or there, but consistent presence in the same way that's normalized as valuable and impactful parental engagement, you may not see at the same level. However, what we find is even though we're not, the ways that Black families support their children's learning is different at times, it is actually just as impactful, and it just looks different. So if I can share an example of what familial support looks like that does not occur during the school day. One of my research partners and a longtime community member, and even members of this organization I consider as family, is the DAPSEP organization, which I know many of you are familiar with, or some of you. DAPSEP stands for Detroit Area Pre-College Engineering Program. And with this program, it's about a 45-year-old organization that provides Saturday and summer STEM curriculum in partnership with local industries and universities that focus on increasing pathways for students in minoritized communities, particularly in the Metro Detroit region. I was a student in that program. U of M Ann Arbor, U of M-Dearborn are universities that have sponsored DAPSEP programming, I believe, for at least 20, 25 years. And my relationship with DAPSEP actually started with my grandmother. So my grandmother, we called her Mama Rita, and she was one who was trying to keep my mom out of trouble. My mom was young. My mom is super smart, and she was young, but with the wrong groups of people. And so my grandmother met Kenneth Hill, who started DAPSEP, and told him that my mom needs help. She said, I can tell she can do some engineering because she can hotwire a car, but I need to get her off the streets and into something productive. So if my mom would tell it, and then she has said this publicly so I can share it, she would say DAPSEP saved her life because it showed her how to use her engineering ways of thinking and her engineering practices and things that she couldn't call engineering, but she could tinker and she could build and she could fix. It gave her something productive to do. And my mom was in one of the inaugural classes. From there, she worked as an automotive consultant, traveling all over the world during our childhood. And I consider her kind of like the Olivia Pope of quality control and continuous improvement. Once we were old enough to attend DAPSEP classes, my mom made sure, as with the thousands of parents in the city of Detroit, that on 2 Saturdays a year, whether rain, sleet, snow, cold, hot, it was never hot because these were always in the fall and winter, but they woke us up on Saturday mornings at about 7 o'clock, even earlier, so we could get there to attend the orientation and to apply for classes. And these are parents who weren't all STEM parents. They weren't all in STEM or had STEM backgrounds, but they all valued the opportunity to pursue STEM education, and specifically engineering education. And so what I want you all to do is, I'm going to actually give another example. The other thing my mom did was she would work long hours to make sure that we were involved in volleyballs and other things she taught us in academic programs, including academic games when we were younger. It's a mathematics competition that we would do on Saturdays. Now, prior to my parents' divorce in the 4th grade, my dad actually introduced us to technology that shaped the way that I view the world. In fact, one of the first times I was disciplined as a child was because I was playing with electrical sockets, and my dad he saw at that moment, though, that I had some interest in how things work. And from that point on, he began to find ways to bring in the most current technology that he could afford, that he had time to get or he could build. And I still remember the day that we were in our upstairs office, and my dad said, I'm about to call your uncle on over the internet. And he was so excited. I had no idea how much of a forerunner he was for us in terms of accessing technology. We do this now. We're on Zoom now, so we've obviously made some advancements. And then finally, I want to talk about my Uncle Cliff and my Aunt Karen. These are people who, my Uncle Cliff is in IT. His wife worked as a consultant for Ford Motor Company, and they attended every graduation. They always, my Uncle Cliff would talk to me about coding and programming. My Aunt Karen has passed away in the last year, but she was one who made sure that she supported our education. And I can go on with people who stepped in our lives to support our learning. What I want to do at this moment is for you to take a moment in the chat and reflect on what I've shared about Black examples of Black families and what they mean. You could also provide maybe references that you think might be useful to share with everyone, or even just comments or critiques. So take a moment and reflect on question 1, what is the Black family? Awesome. Thank you, Jennifer. So Jennifer shares that she can relate to the experience on extended family and community investment in her education in Barbados. Great. And I think that this is something that we miss in scholarship or parental engagement and the impact of engagement, even defining it, because we miss out on the rich diversity and ways that family can support with or without direct knowledge of STEM. And so I want to be careful not to say that we are seeing the impact. Some of my research shows the impact of students who had family members who were STEM professionals. But I also want to make sure that I'm equally looking at families who don't have the STEM specific background. So they're both valuable. Exactly. She said, even now her teachers want to know how she's doing. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So let's move on to question 2. So what are some of the theoretical underpinnings of the work that I'm doing? Yeah, this is great. I want to just make sure I look at the comments. We have Matthew Christopher saying, the Black family extends way beyond the traditional nuclear family. Grandparents playing a role, caretakers, guardian, absolutely. Awesome. Yeah, it takes a village. There's a quote that I have often heard, it takes a village to raise a child. And I think that that's a good explanation of how the community works together to make sure, and how it should work together to make sure that the children become who they need to be. So what are some of the theoretical underpinnings of this work? That's my second question. I believe that by taking an asset-based research approach, that I'm using methods which value, uplift, and dignify Black cultural ways of knowing, doing, and being. And I actually want to acknowledge Dr. James Holly Jr.'s work, especially with the use of the word dignify, and how do we bring dignity to experiences that we've seen growing up, but in the scholarship. How do we bring and elevate and highlight the dignity of what's actually being done, instead of, and really working to counter a lot of what scholars, even in their best attempts, who have translated the responsibility of supporting students of color in STEM to things that brokenness or things that are perceived as broken in the community. Yet throughout this time, this community is still here. And so I really want to use this work to do this, to value, uplift, and dignify Black cultural ways of knowing, doing, and being. And so for my work, the ways that I do that is I've used the first 2, and the last one is one that I've recently become familiar with, but I wanted to make sure to share for those who are interested in exploring more. But there's the community cultural wealth framework. And this, one second, my notes. They disappeared. There it is. So with the community cultural wealth framework, this is one that I was drawn to as I was trying to think about how there's this essence of a Black community as providing something for the community within the community. And I also was trying to think about the reality that we live in a society where race and racism are they're embedded and entangled within the history of the United States. and we can't try to separate one from the other, or even our responses and the ways that we've chosen to overcome sometimes have emerged because of race and racism, but everything that's valuable in the Black community isn't because of racism. And so when I was looking for initially, when I started as a doctoral student, thinking about are there any theories or frameworks that will help me understand and elevate the experiences, skills, and knowledges of the Black community, or Black communities, what exists. And in 2005, Dr. Tara Yoso defined community cultural wealth as an array of knowledges, skills, abilities, and contexts possessed and used by communities of color to survive and resist racism and other forms of oppression. She then went on to define and identify 6 forms of capital, and she posits that other forms may also exist. I also was considering with her work that while she did do some investigation of Black families, her work primarily centered around Latinx communities. And so when I read her 6 forms of capital, I was intrigued, and I was even challenged because I started seeing something different when I started looking at community cultural wealth and Black communities. And that's something that is a concept that I'm working with called making do capital, or innovative capital. And that's this idea where when Black communities are faced with opposition or resistance, when they are faced with, I think, like opportunities being taken away, or what looks like resources being taken away, we get very innovative and we make things happen. And when I was doing some of my previous work, I also coupled it and with the Engineer of 2020 attributes as a conceptual framework. And that helped me to give me some engineering knowledge around, or engineering language, potentially. How do I expand the definition of engineering to include some other attributes to help me look within scholarship? And I'll talk about that in a second. And I realized that our ability to be resilient and innovative is actually a source for me, from what I'm seeing and what I'm exploring now, could be a source of capital, of cultural wealth that can be used as an asset and can be leveraged by members of the community. I also noticed that with community cultural wealth and with the second ecological systems theory introduced by Brothenbrenner, is that members of the community, particularly as we've talked about this, the Black community is very extensive, and it's an extensive network of kinship ties, is that very rarely do you have someone where the system and the community just acts upon the person, and the person does not have the responsibility or feel the responsibility to then give back or act on the environment itself. And I started to wonder kind of what's going on there. What is this relationship between the child who's maturing and matriculating through school, the community surrounding them, the family, the extended family surrounding them and supporting them. And as they matriculate, when I was exploring my data, I started finding out that I interviewed some Black men in undergraduate studies in engineering, and they started sharing with me that they felt a responsibility to reach back and pull. And so it's kind of this reaching as they climb mentality. It wasn't a choice. I mean, they could make the choice, but they felt the weight of that and had to balance that as they continued in school. The ecological systems theory is one that I've thought about often because it views child development as a complex systems of relationships affected by multiple levels of the surrounding environment. From the immediate settings of the family and the school to broad cultural laws, customs, values, and norms. It identifies the microsystem, a mesosystem, exosystems, the macrosystem, and a chronosystem. And with the microsystem being the most influential level of this theory. And this includes the most immediate environmental settings. And so again, now we have a developmental theory that might help us explore the impact of family at different levels, especially if we're looking at Black families as having this expansive kinship tie. Yes, thank you so much, Sarah, for sharing that. And finally, something that these two don't, that the community cultural wealth theory and ecological systems theory don't address directly, particularly EST, but is McCarthy and Foubert's racial realist parent engagement framework. And it's something I admittedly am learning about now. But what I like about this framework is that it investigates parents' relationships with schools. So remember earlier I talked about we don't have a really rich understanding, at least through the parent engagement literature, on exactly potentially what Black parental engagement might look like and the impact. And what this framework does is it challenges implications of deficit framing that shifts Black parents, that actually looks at the impact of anti-Black racism in school policies and talks about the ways that parents raise their children to address and to be students in systems that are anti-Black and racist by nature or by design. And this is something that I see a lot in my work, is that you'll hear students, in my data, I've had students tell me, my dad told me I had to work twice as hard as the white students to get just as far, to get the same recognition. Or, they I have to prove myself when I get in the classroom. So you have that, the prove them wrong syndrome, which I think was James Moore talked about in his research. And so what's the role of parents in the racial socialization of their children, and what is the direct impact that has on their learning and in their matriculation? We see that there is an impact. Students feel that their families did need to prepare them for these things, and they were facing racial situations from my data, even in high school, and I wouldn't be surprised if earlier. And so parents have the responsibility not just to be in the classroom at a PTO meeting, but to also, when they're thinking about their children going into the world, and as we look at engineering, preparing their children to engage and then to move successfully in racist educational environments. So that's where we think about the last idea of centering Black families' rightful presence, and this is my last idea for point 2, is this notion defined by Calabrese and Barton 2020. And they define rightful presence as, we view rightful presence as legitimate membership in a classroom community because of who one is, not who one should be, in which the practices of that community work towards and support restructuring power dynamics toward more just ends through making injustice and social change visible. So as I think about the theoretical underpinnings of this work, I have to respect Black families' rightful presence in STEM and not restrict their presence to what is normalized as in the classroom, but I have to look at the impact that they're making outside the classroom, the academic support, the standards for academic excellence, the expectations to perform well, I have to look at their teachings around how to navigate a racialized society. I have to think about the different ways that parents provide. If they themselves do not have STEM, they send their children to free STEM programming in the communities, or they provide access to their networks. And also, I'm going to talk about the ways I do this, but this is not just in response to how do we, it's not just about families who don't have access to STEM, but it's also centering the reality is that Black people have contributed in innovative ways throughout history. They have contributed to invention and to engineering throughout history, not just in American history. And so because of these things, we have to center Black families as having a rightful presence, because we do. And so one of the things I grew up with growing up in my house, we grew up with the Africana Studies professor, Dr. Ivan Van Sertima books. He had one book that I remember growing up that came before Columbus. And so my mother valued reminding us that we had rightful presence in this world and society, but particularly in the areas of innovation and invention. And so what I want to do here, let me think about what my next slide would be. Perfect. I want to take a moment here and stop. And does someone have their hand up? I only see it. Let me see if I can zoom out. I want to take a moment and stop here and reflect on any questions or comments anyone may have. You can put them, I'll take a moment and stop, and you can put them in the chat. So any comments or questions on, let me go back. Oops. What are some of the theoretical underpinnings of this work? Okay. Awesome, we'll keep going. So my third question that kind of guides our talk today, our time today, is what are some appropriate methodologies for centering Black families? And so I thought I'd kind of walk you through my journey of learning how to do this research. And so there are 4 points I want to share. When I first started going down this direction, I thought I wanted to deepen my scholarly knowledge on Black contributions to STEM. And as I mentioned earlier in my dissertation, I created a conceptual framework of community cultural wealth and the engineer of 2020 attributes. They were very aspirational in nature. It was a report that was developed to try to identify kind of where do we want engineering to be as we look down the line. I think the report maybe come out in 2008. But this idea of maybe we needed a more broad definition of what engineering is in order to understand how to look for it in the lived experiences of Black people. And so I used that as a reference, and I use those as keywords to look throughout scholarship on Black people to see where is some evidence of these engineering attributes and ways of thinking at play within Black communities. And what I ended up landing on, a couple of resources, I have them here, is Rayvon Fouché was thinking about the inventive spirit of Black innovators in the time of segregation. Sluby looked at some of the inventions and of African American people. And so also then in my dissertation, I included that was my literature review, was first to deepen my scholarly knowledge on what we understand about Black contributions. I can just say when I was younger, in my church, I would do moments in Black history. And obviously I was drawn to those that were innovative in nature. But and I share that because there is kind of informal storytelling approaches that I have in my community to sharing these inventions. And I wanted to see if this informal way of storytelling and sharing knowledge, we could kind of document it, if they were documented also in scholarly literature to help me build my dissertation. So first I deepened my knowledge and I found some great references there. The second way that I started to learn how to center Black families is I had some access to secondary data. So I had some interviews. There were videos and in-home interviews, audio interviews. I looked for opportunities for parents and children to reflect on what was happening in their home or what had happened. And I used that to understand how families model engineering ways of thinking, values, and practices. From there, I was able to identify some practices that I wanted to explore more on specific ways that parents supported their children. Some things included, like as I mentioned, modeling how to make do, so how to be resilient and innovative together. We looked at how parents provide resources and tools. For example, in one study, a student, there was a young man who liked to take apart things. So he took apart his parents' lawnmower and his mom said, no, not that one. And she would say, oh my gosh, I have to, she keeps materials available for him to take apart so that he can explore. And so maybe parents are providing resources to explore. Other participants in the secondary data talked about parents helping them with their math homework, helping them with the homework. And so then I decided, okay, I have secondary data where I can look at the data that wasn't initially collected by me to look and see if I can see some narratives and some understanding of the kind of the role of Black families in learning and in engineering development. And then I thought I should generate my own data with participants as they reflect on pre-college familial impact. We see similar methods used by Chris Wright and his team in his recent work, and Brian Burt does a lot of that with his investigation of Black men in doctoral programs. And that he looks at the origins of their stories, particularly those in STEM. And what we found when I started to collect my own data and talk to students directly about the pre-college familial impact is that all families aren't the same, as I mentioned before, yet their support is what the students held on to even in times of challenge when they got to engineering. They also commented that their family had some specific practices. One that I'll mention, one student talked about how his father, when they would go to the grocery store, would challenge him to calculate, to look at the items in the cart, create a calculation for how much all that would cost, and they would make a game where by the time they got to the checkout lane, the son would have to come up with the estimate of how much that would cost. The same father would also study his son's homework and then study his textbook, and then at home, he would help him with his math homework. And I hope you can see how if we miss those experiences in parental engagement literature, we miss out on the richness of a parent who may not be able to come to the school building because their work schedule may be inflexible, but they are doing work behind the scenes to support STEM-related learning. Something else that was interesting is, and I have another publication under review about this, is that Black men in bullet 3 who came from homes where they were living in poverty and they did not. I remember I asked him in the interview, he said, I moved around a lot. And I said, oh, were you in a military family? He says, no, I'm in a poor family. And so his family, he says, he moved around a lot, and he had to make a decision. Did he want to be like his family and stay in this what he considered a poor state, or did he want to excel and be motivated to come back and help them out? That same family, though, were those that did not have engineering experiences, but motivated him and pushed him to succeed and to continue on in school and to be the one that made it. And so I started to generate more data to look at the different types of familial support and impact. And so now in my most recent approach and my most recent method is actually to work with the families. And that's something I'm learning to value even more. And what I see here is that in my recent study, I have a career award where I am launching a DAP-SUP class using some curriculum developed by the Henry Ford Museum here in Dearborn. And my goal is to work with families, 6th grade students and their parents, whoever can attend, to prepare them for the Invention Convention, which is an international competition that will be hosted here in Michigan. And what I'm realizing is that I need to kind of be in the moment with the families, asking them questions. And I also have to earn the right and the trust to be in these spaces. So we have our DAP-SUP class, which is a 4 to 6 week class. And then after this class, I'm actually giving them cameras that they will put in their homes, and they will record their design sessions. And I get to explore the interactions between the families kind of as it's happening. We also get to reflect, and I also get to get feedback from the parents on what they want to see in curriculum like this. And then the students will then compete in Invention Convention. And this continues, and I'm actually modifying the Henry Ford curriculum, infusing it with knowledge around Black innovators and Black inventors. And what I hope to see is students reflecting on, we're going to identify some key Black inventors. And I hope to see that the students are drawing upon the inventive stories of these Black innovators and inventors, that parents are drawing upon, whether they be stories from the class, their own experiences and knowledge, and that the student themselves see themselves as someone who can innovate and be a part of the inventive legacy that we know exists within the Black community. One thing that I'll share from that current study is I had a session with the students just last week, and the students, I gave them some characteristics of innovators and inventors from the curriculum. And the student said, that's my mom. My mom is an innovator. His mom creates body butters and body scrubs and body oils. And he could identify that in his own home, his mother was one who could had some of these characteristics of asking questions, taking risks, thinking outside the box, working with others. And this is something that I want to document in the scholarship that'll come from my work. So now on to my fourth question. What do we know about the impact of Black families' rightful presence? I want to share this excerpt from Herndon and Hurt, 2004. Family members and extended family who spend time reviewing homework and helping students develop mathematics, science, and engineering identities, and who teach strategies to navigate and succeed in new environments, positively influence the students in academic achievement and social development. And I just want to share two examples from a work that I have under review. I had students participate in a 3-year study. Some did not make it throughout the 3 years. This is my secondary data. One student's name is Philip, and then we have excerpts from his mom and dad. And these examples I share show Philip's resourcefulness and his ability to make connections across learning settings and the different things that we see his parents doing to support that. So I was the interviewer and I asked, how do you know that you are going to use the ties to make people? So as background, Philip had this uncanny ability to take any resource available and make it into either origami men or just to build things just out of whatever he had. He could build anything. So in this case, he was using his father's ties to make origami people. Philip responds, I didn't know at first, but like when it needed to be like stable and stuff, I just thought of strings in my head and tying stuff together. I found that this was an example of him learning to make do, be resourceful. He was using available resources to solve a given problem. His mom observed, he's good at drawing. He's very good at making things out of, like I said, nothing. Another example of Philip being resourceful. His mom later says, it all comes from up here. She's referring to his brain, his imagination. So from his own brain, it's just a matter of looking at something and thinking of it and putting together, and whatever it turns out. Another example of his resourcefulness. And finally, his dad's observation. I mean, he's creative, he's artistic. It's obviously there, the mechanical side of it. I think it's an underlying part of it because he sees how this changes to this or this does that. But I think it starts out with an artistic avenue. But then there's some technical side to it because I think that's underlying in how he manipulates materials or what he does with a certain objects. So his father can see, we see with this example from Philip that his parents are observant. They see that that he has this ability to make connections and to create things from his imagination. And in fact, they even allow him to use his ties to do so. And they see that he can work between settings, between mechanical and his imagination, and even add some technical aspects to it. And I want to share one more example. Phillips, now this talks about parental support, how they find activities, and how they even may have career and academic conversations. Dad says, I mean, it's encouraged, and by it, he means design. We praise him when he does. He brings in things. He's proud of what he does, so he brings them to us. So he supports, his father is moderately supportive. What I found in the data was moderately supportive of his design. He was more concerned that he may have wanted him to perform in other areas of studies. His mom says for Christmas, he gets art books. I bought him different charcoal pencils, and we get him the books on how to draw. Again, mom supports. But as we see in the third quote, but right now his creativity is certainly important, but his education is first priority. So now we see that the parents are helping to create boundaries around what they consider important and what's prioritized in their home. So creating academic standards. And then finally, mom says, I actually enrolled him in an art class and he's learning how to draw. So he goes there once a week. That's me trying to get him out of this video games because he's not doing well with his grades. This was taken in year 2. And what we find is that parents were observant from year to year, and they tried to create opportunities for him to increase his academic success. They thought video games were a problem that was across his 3 years, that video games were actually an area of concern for them. And so they wanted to work to find activities to support his STEM ways of thinking. And with that, I want to stop here, and I don't know how long we have for questions, but I want to take questions about any of the 4 questions or anything related to my work. So I'll go back to the slide with all 4 questions so we can have that up for reference. Thank you.
People can add questions either to chat, or you should be able to also use the Q&A function here.